Welcome, everyone. This is Back to the Bible. You know, living as God's people in today's culture requires you to see things differently than the rest of the world. So today, pastor and Bible teacher Bryan helps you focus on the faith-building strategies and perspectives Peter shared with the Christ followers of his time. After Bryan's message, he'll join Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney in studio to talk about how to put these faith-building principles to work in your life. Now here's Bryan with today's message.
How, in a culture of despair, do we still love life and find good? That's what we want to talk about, but I'll tell you right up front, the answer's probably not what you think. If you have a Bible, turn with us to 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 8. He says, to sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you are called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. So he opens the paragraph by saying, this is a summary of where we've been. We go back to the reminder that we have been radically changed on the basis of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Christianity is not a try-harder religion. It's based on the fact that on the basis of the grace and mercy of God, we have been radically changed. And so this new life flows out of this transformation that has taken place. We are told that we are the people of God. We're God's own possession. But with that wonderful truth comes responsibility. We have been called, and we've been called to proclaim the excellencies of the one who has transferred us out of darkness into his marvelous light. How do we do that? We do that by abstaining from fleshly lusts. Basically, as long as we're tied up with our own sin, that's all we think about, that's all we focus on, sin makes us selfish. That's kind of like step one. Step two is then we make our behavior and therefore our message attractive to an unbelieving world by doing good works. Peter has reminded us again and again, it's not enough just to have words. There must be something in our behavior that demonstrates we have been radically changed. He's talked about what that looks like as citizens, what that looks like in unfair relationships, what that looks like at home, and now we summarize it with a series of commands. To sum up, all of you, be harmonious. The word literally means to be united around a mission. If you think of the word harmony, our English word flows out of this Greek word. You think of the melody line, and that's kind of the driving mission. And then all of the harmony is built around that. That's kind of the concept. So you can think in terms that make sense to you, whether you're talking about an orchestra, whether you're talking about an athletic team, whether you're talking about the military, you're talking about different people, different personalities, different stories, different backgrounds. But ultimately, we lay our differences aside in order to unite around the common mission. That's kind of the heartbeat of this term. All of us are aware there's a lot of concern and struggle in all the division that seems to characterize our culture today. We are a collection of individuals. Individualism, this selfish, this self-centered attitude has become almost a virtue in our culture. There is no driving mission that causes us to lay down differences and come together. Consequently, we're nothing more than a collection of individuals, and what we see is only going to get worse until that changes. But we remind ourselves, we're not just the culture. By the grace and mercy of God, we are the people of God. And we do have a uniting mission. We do have a sense of purpose that drives and defines us, that we lay aside our differences and we come together to accomplish the mission. That's the idea of harmonious. Sympathetic is pretty much what we would think of it. It's kind of this caring connection with people's feelings. The Greek word includes both joys and sorrows. We weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice. But we come together and experience those emotions together. Brotherly is kind of a term that has less and less meaning for us as our families become more and more kind of fractured and dysfunctional. But maybe the terminology that would recapture it is this idea of a band of brothers, this military idea where we are on a mission, we're different people from different backgrounds, but we come together as a band of brothers to accomplish the mission. The idea is that kind of we're family. We all have relationships that get strained and are difficult, and a lot of those we just kind of let go. It isn't worth the energy to try to sort it out. But it's different when it's family. We'll expend a lot of energy and time to somehow face into it, work through it, and somehow make progress because there's this sense that this is different. We're family. That's the idea of brotherly. There's this reminder that we are united together as the people of God. I reminded us several weeks ago that the church is made up of people. And people genuinely are all kind of odd and awkward and different. We're all kind of weird in our own ways. But there is a sense in which, but we are the people of God. We work through that and we come together to accomplish the mission. It's a high level of commitment in order to come together. Kind-hearted is just what you would think of. We might use the word compassion, just a genuine, caring spirit for one another. And humble in spirit. The Greek word really reflects thinking of others as more important than yourself. It's good to remind ourselves whenever we see the concept of humility in the New Testament, that this was contrary to the value system in a Greco-Roman culture. They did not see humility as a virtue. They actually saw it as a weakness. It was all about me and my strength and whatever I needed to get done. So whenever you see this concept of humility, it was really dramatically contrary to the prevailing culture. But this whole attitude that was in Jesus should be reflected in his people, that we put others first, reflecting the life change we have in Christ. So think of verse 8 and these commands, which are kind of summing up the discussion that we've had, as life within the family of God. And the basic idea is that it creates a place of refuge. It's a place where we can go, where we are aliens and strangers together. So that we have some sort of a place of refuge where we can grow, where we can heal, where we can gain strength in order to go out there. And it's not going to be that way out there. So the idea is if we can't pull it together in here, we're never going to be faithful out there.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Our message continues in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Here again is Bryan Clark.
So verse 9 kind of moves out to the broader culture. Not returning evil for evil or insult for insult. Whether you're talking about verbally, whether you're talking about social media, it's kind of a new response that we don't return evil for evil. We don't return insult for insult. We were told by Peter that when Jesus was verbally abused, reviled, he did not revile in return. The text is not a hunker down and take it text. It's actually proactive. We do something in return. We give a blessing. Literally, the word means to speak well of someone, giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. We were blessed in order to be a blessing. Our first reaction would be that doesn't seem fair. If people insult us, in return, we offer a blessing. But if you remember, I offered us a news flash. Newsflash, life isn't fair. The text tells us we should expect to be slandered. We should expect to be treated unfairly. Peter reminded us that's the story of Jesus. It wasn't fair that Jesus took our sins upon himself on the cross. It wasn't fair that Jesus died in our place. We, as the people of God, are the last people that should be talking about fairness. But Peter says that is the pattern, that's the example that we're to follow. So as people slander us, as people insult us, as people are unfair to us, we don't just hunker down and take it. We actually proactively respond by offering some sort of a blessing. Now, this is really important to think about. I think sometimes it gets in the heads of Christians that in order to be faithful, in order to take our stand as the people of God, we must fight back. You see a lot of this on social media. There's this idea that we somehow have to fight back and take back the country. And that's what it means to be a Christian, and that's what it means to be strong, and that's what it means to be faithful to our calling. We tend to think, because our words are biblical, our words are true, because our words are meaningful to us, therefore those words will be convincing. And people will hear them, people will read them, and in this moment of clarity, they will say, you know, you're right, I'm wrong, hallelujah, my life has been changed. But here's what is actually happening. We live in a very angry culture. The anger is for several reasons, but people are angry, people are hostile, people are frustrated, people are fearful, and it comes out in really destructive ways. When we enter into that and we respond in kind, people are not sorting out the argument and the words we're using. They are just perceiving us to be another angry demographic, just like everyone else. It's helpful to understand that the people that agree with you will applaud you. The people that disagree are just made angry. But at the end of the day, you're not changing the world. What Peter is saying is what's going to cause us as the people of God to be distinct is that our behavior is so other than what is so common in our culture. People will have to back up and say, what is the deal with these people that are so radically different? Think about it. In a culture of such anger and hostility and intolerance, if rather than responding in kind, we responded with a blessing, we responded in a way that is so unlike the rest of the culture, it would cause people to stop and wonder, who are these people? And what makes them act like that? The commands in verses 8 and 9 are really meant to be the strategy to accomplish that. Our calling is to proclaim the excellencies of He who has transferred us out of darkness into light. Our behavior must reflect that rather audacious claim. In verse 10, you see the word for. Now, this is the Greek word gar, G-A-R in English. We refer to this as an explanatory gar. Now, I know you're thrilled to know that. You probably want to write that down. But it actually is an important point, because an explanatory gar is basically saying what follows is the theological foundation, the rationale that supports why we should obey verses 8 and 9. And it's essentially a quote from Psalm 34. So before we read the words of Psalm 34, I want to remind us of a couple of things. First of all, Psalm 34 was written by David while he was in the wilderness school of leadership. It was written when David, as a teenage boy, trusted God and took on the giant Goliath and toppled him to the ground. It was a great moment in Israel's history. It set them free from the Philistines. David continued to trust God, and God did amazing things through young teenage David. But Saul was so threatened by David, Saul determined he must kill David before David takes over the kingdom. So David, after being faithful to God, is rewarded by having to flee as a fugitive and live in the wilderness, running for his life for more than a decade. It must have been a time of great hurt, a time of great confusion, a time of wondering, where's God in all of this? You just try to do the right thing, and this is what you get in return. Specifically, Psalm 34 was written when David made some bad decisions and ended up in the presence of the Philistine king Abimelech. David was fearful that Abimelech would kill him, having heard the stories of David as a warrior, so David pretended to be mentally insane. As a result of that, Abimelech was convinced David's lost his mind and tossed him out. It was out of that experience that David writes these words. So before you're tempted to say, well, you don't know my circumstances. You don't know my story. You don't know why this wouldn't work for me. Let's remember that David is saying, in the midst of those circumstances, it was possible to love life and to see good days. Let's also remind ourselves that the first readers were those who had been driven out of their homeland because of persecution. They had ended up in northern Turkey as aliens and strangers, foreigners with few rights and privileges, beginning to go through persecution, but that persecution was about to increase dramatically. Even Peter, who writes these words, would soon be put to death by Nero. So we remind ourselves before we say, but you don't know my circumstances. You don't know why this wouldn't be fair for me. Let's remember the context of the people for whom this is being written, and they are being told in the midst of your circumstances, you can love life and see good days. So with that in mind, we read, the one who desires life, to love, and to see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit.
Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
All right, Bryan, the last words of your message today remind us of something the Bible tells us over and over. We have got to get control of our tongues.
Yeah, it's interesting how often that message comes up. It's very common. It's all over the book of Proverbs. We had it in James. Now it shows up again. And honestly, we lose our witness when our tongue is out of control. It's as simple as that. So remember, Jesus said actually our tongue's a symptom of something deeper. So it's just coming out our mouths, but the problem's deeper than that. And I think it's also helpful when things slip out, if I could put that in quotes, it's like it didn't really just slip out. It's not a oops moment. There's something inside of me that was causing that. So even for me as a preacher, one of the things I figured out early on is how I talk in private will come out on the stage. It just will. So I'm really careful about how I speak in private because it's going to come out on the stage, and that really helps me discipline myself even in my most private conversations.
That's a good tip. I've actually dealt with this myself, and there was a good couple of months where I had to change my go tandem to help me out with this. So that's good advice.
Yeah, it's a big problem for all of us.
Bryan, in our culture today, our actions speak louder than any kind of words.
Yeah, so actions give our words credibility, help people process whether they think it's true or not. And honestly, we live in a culture where everybody's skeptical, so truth is devalued. But when somebody's actually living in a way that's consistent with what they say they believe is true, there's a lot of power in that.
Peter's writing this letter to people under persecution. The whole time he's telling people to love and see good days ahead. And that actually sounds like James with counting it all joy.
Yeah, it's a lot like James. It's all about perspective. And again, it's about settling whether we're here to set up heaven on earth or here to accomplish a mission. And I think it's interesting, David wrote those words. So Peter's quoting David from Psalm 34 during his time in the wilderness, about a decade and a half of fleeing from Saul. So nobody could say, well, you don't know how hard my life has been. It's like David's life was really hard when he wrote those words. The first readers were people being persecuted, and it was going to get a lot worse. So I can choose to love and see good days regardless of my circumstances. It's my choice. It's a perspective I choose to take.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org.